So here we have a very interesting situation. Country A is absolutely more productive than country B. If we remember, we saw that it takes 3 hours in country A to make a good S, and it takes 6 hours to make 1 unit of good T, while in country B it takes 12 and 8 hours to do the same thing. So think about country A as a country like the US and country B as a country like Mexico. So the US is just like richer, it is more technologically advanced than Mexico, and the productivity is higher in every sector. Here, what are we doing? We are deriving conditions that relate the wage in the US and the wage in Mexico, or the wage in country A and the wage in country B. And what are we concretely doing? We're looking at the ratio between the wage in the US and the wage in Mexico converted into the dollar, into local currency. So that would be what in this slide is WA divided by E, the exchange rate, times WB. Now, if this ratio, if this quantity is greater than 1, then it means that the wage in the US has to be greater than the wage in Mexico converted in dollars. If this quantity is less than 1, the opposite has to be true. So we're basically checking these conditions that tell us what is needed in terms of wages for countries to be able to trade according to the theory of comparative advantage. And what are we finding? Well, when we combine these conditions that we have found, we find that the wage in the US relative to the wage in Mexico converted in dollars has to be between 4 divided by 3 and 4. What does this mean? Well, at the minimum, the wage ratio is to be such that the wage in the US is greater relative to the wage in Mexico is greater than 1, because it's 4 divided by 3 is greater than 1. At the maximum, the wage in the US compared to the wage in the poor country in Mexico has to be less than 4. So that tells us the interval of values for our ratio of wages, and that is telling us that according to the theory of comparative advantage, as long as the wages are in this interval, it makes sense for a country that is more productive to trade with a country that is less productive. Okay, so let's remember we said the when we open up to trade according to comparative advantage, GDP grows and utility grows because we get access to a higher consumption possibility frontier. Now we're asking, for a country that is richer, that is more productive, does it still make sense to trade with a country that is poorer? The theory of comparative advantage is telling us that as long as the wage is between these two numbers, which is the relative wage actually, so the ratio of the wage in the rich country compared to the wage in the poor country is between 4/3 and 4, then yes, it makes sense to trade with a country that is less productive. So this gives us a little bit of an answer when we think about, does it make sense for the US or for a developed country to trade with a nation that is less productive? The theory says as long as the wage is between, the relative wage is between these two, this is between this interval, it does make sense. The theory also tells us, though, that the wage doesn't have to get out of control in a sense. Imagine that, so here we have set, we have a competitive market, and we have we have found the wage using the assumption that markets are competitive. Suppose that markets are not competitive. For example, there's unions. And suppose that the wage doesn't reflect any more productivity. Well, that could be a problem if the wage goes out this interval that we have found. So if wages are too high or they're too low, then it wouldn't make sense anymore to trade with a poorer country. So the two lessons that we learn are the following. One, it makes sense to trade with a country that is less productive in an absolute sense. Two, it makes sense as long as wages are within a certain interval, which means that wages don't have to get in the rich country or in the poor country too far away from the competitive benchmark.